everyone, it's Michael, and it's finally time for me to give you an Orchid Care 101 video. Now, I've shied away from making this video for quite some time because there are so many qualifiers when it comes to orchid care. People reach out to me all the time, friends, family, subscribers, and they're just like, Michael, I got an orchid. You're the orchid guy. What do I do? And I have so many qualifying questions like, okay, well, what type of orchid is it? What potting medium did it come in? What stage of its growth cycle is it in? There's a lot of different factors that impact how you're going to care for an orchid. So asking me, how do I care for orchids is a lot like saying, I don't know, how do I make a person in my life happy? It's like, well, who is that person? What makes them tick? What do they enjoy? So it's a very similar concept here. Now, having said that, there are some universal orchid care principles that can be mobilized as you introduce yourself to caring for orchids. And that's really what I'm going to cover today. Now, having said that, I do want to give you the disclaimer. There is absolutely no substitute for you doing your own research. You need to find out what type of plant you have. You need to find out what type of care it prefers. You need to figure out the specifics of how that plant wants to be interacted with. But in the meantime, as you figure out all of those things, I'm going to give you some general care tips and tricks to help ensure that you don't kill the plant before you get that far. Now, the first thing that we're going to cover in this discussion is light. Now, as a general rule of thumb, bearing in mind there are tons of exceptions and extenuating circumstances, orchids prefer bright, indirect light, meaning they want to enjoy the benefits of the sun, but they don't want to make direct contact with it. So it's best practice when you first get your orchid to not put it in a windowsill where it's going to get direct beams of sun. You want to place it in proximity to that window where it'll get a lot of bright or filtered light, but not make direct contact. Now, I took a quick video to illustrate exactly what I'm talking about. When I say bright, indirect sunlight, this is precisely what I'm talking about. All of the orchids on this wall receive copious amounts of natural light, but have no direct contact with the sun. Now, this is quite different than what's happening on the windowsill because all of these orchids over here are orchids that not only can endure higher light levels, but require higher light levels. But until you've validated that you have an orchid that can take higher light levels, the safe spot is to always place them in a zone of bright, indirect light. Now, as you familiarize yourself with your plant and as you do the research to understand precisely what it wants, you'll start to understand if it needs to get more light or less light. But there are risks on both ends of the spectrum. If you give your orchid too much light, there's the possibility that it will burn. If you give your orchid too little light, that's when they stop flowering. But I will say it's a safer bet to give your orchid not enough light than it is to give it too much light because that'll kill it much faster. Now, a really general rule of thumb indicator here is that orchids should be a really lovely, vibrant shade of green. If you see that an orchid is super dark green, it means that it's probably not getting enough light. If you see that an orchid is almost borderline like on the yellow end of the green-yellow spectrum, that's when it's getting too much light. So feel free to use that as a visual indicator of whether you need to up or lower your lighting levels. Now let's talk about air movement. No matter what type of orchid you have, whether it's epiphytic, meaning it grows up in the trees with its roots in the air, or terrestrial, meaning it grows on the ground with its roots in the soil, you want to ensure that your orchid has proper air movement. Now, the reason for that is orchids are quite susceptible to different forms of bacterial rot. So if you allow moisture to sit on any part of the plant for too long, it'll become stagnant, it'll start to breed bacteria, and it can kill the plant very quickly. So for that reason, you really want to preserve an environment in which air is constantly moving, so that if there is moisture sitting somewhere in the plant, it'll eventually dry out by virtue of the moving air around it. If you are growing in an outdoor environment, you really don't have to worry about this step because nature will always take care of its own breezes. But since I am an urban orchid grower and I'm growing in the context of an apartment, I have to create some strong sources of moving air. So of course I like to leverage my ceiling fan. Over this way, I like to use our air conditioning unit to create a strong cross breeze. And then what I believe is the most important is a source of natural, fresh air. So I crack our window open for a few hours every single day just to ensure that the air inside the apartment doesn't become stale or stagnant. Now let's talk about watering. Now, in my opinion, this is the single most critical part of what you do as an orchid grower because orchids are actually quite adaptable. If you don't give them high enough humidity, they will adapt. If you don't give them high enough light levels, they will survive. But if you mess up the watering piece, the orchid will die very quickly. So just to give you a general snapshot, Overwatering is typically the culprit of orchid death more than underwatering. So you have to bear in mind, these plants are quite self-sustaining. They grow up on trees with the roots out in the air, so they like to breathe. Now, if you over-inundate them with too much water, you're going to suffocate them super quickly. The root system will rot out, and then it will not be able to hydrate itself. So this is the paradox that a lot of people struggle with. They're like, oh, it looks dehydrated, I need to water more. Totally wrong. When in doubt, do not water. So wait till your orchid approaches dryness. You don't have to allow it to become completely bone dry, but wait till it approaches like a real legible dryness and then water. That is the general preference for most orchids. Again, bearing in mind that there are extenuating circumstances and exceptions. Now let's go a little bit deeper. We have to talk about water quality. So in the wild, orchids are receiving rainwater, which is filtered perfectly by nature. So there's something called TDS. I will link a video about it below if you're interested, but it stands for total dissolved solids. It refers to the content of solids that are dissolved in the water. Now, orchids will typically receive very low TDS water from Mother Nature. So if you take an orchid that's used to receiving that quality of water and start watering it with Los Angeles tap water, it'll kill the plant so fast because it doesn't want all that magnesium, it doesn't want all the calcium, it doesn't want all the fluoride that's in the water. So when watering your orchids, it's imperative that you are giving them the cleanest water possible. So I have reverse osmosis water. I had it installed specifically for the care of my plants. But if you don't have that accessible to you, you can definitely use distilled water. You can buy it at any grocery store, any supermarket. That's what I did for years while I was living in Colorado. Or if you have the luxury of being able to put a bucket outside and collect a lot of rainwater, use rainwater. Nature made it perfect, just use that. But ensure that the water you're using to take care of your plants is very clean. Now, the last component about watering that I'm going to address is you have to water properly around the plant. So you never want to water directly into the plant itself because, like I said earlier, if you don't have proper air movement to completely dry that out, it's going to create bacterial rot. So make sure that when you're pouring water into your containers, you're watering into the medium around the plant, but never into the plant itself. Now, I took a quick video to illustrate exactly what I'm talking about, and I'll play it right here. So like I was saying, you never want to water into the plant itself. You want to water right around it. So I have this cute little bottle that I use. It's a nice squeeze bottle that allows me to be really controlled about where I place it. So I'm going to just go ahead and insert it right into this area, and I'm going to give it water this way, but I'm never going to water into the crown of the plant because that is a quick and easy way to create rot. Now I'll do it again over here. I'll come right around. I'll go into the potting medium itself, never onto the plant itself, and I will water. Now let's move on to a discussion of humidity. Now, humidity is one of those things that's super easy to overlook as an orchid grower, and I actually ignored it for quite some time while I was living in Colorado, which was a huge oversight that was very much to the detriment of my plants because it's such an arid climate. Now, once I incorporated elevated humidity into my environment, all of my plants hit a stride. All of them really started to move forward with a lot of momentum. Now, we have to remember that orchids don't just hydrate themselves through their root systems. They hydrate through their leaves, they hydrate through their pseudobulbs, they hydrate through everything. So ensuring that there is moisture content in the air that they can draw from is so important. So there's a few ways to accomplish this, and I will show you how. When it comes to the discussion of humidity, my preference is always to raise the total ambient humidity, meaning we're going to raise the total percentage of humidity that exists in the air and the overall environment. Now, the best way to do that, in my opinion, is to use an ultrasonic humidifier. So this is the one I use. It's super effective. It takes the natural humidity of my environment, which runs around 30%, all the way up to currently 57%, which is just fantastic for orchids. Now, if you don't want to do that, you can always use the option of a humidity tray. So here's a makeshift setup of exactly that. You can see I have a layer of pebbles at the bottom. You can use marbles, you can use rocks. I'm using leca here. You put some water in the bottom, and as that water evaporates, it creates a little atmosphere of humidity directly around the plant. So that's another option for you if you don't want to go all the way into the semantics of using a humidifier. Last but not least, we're going to move into a discussion around fertilizer. Now, fertilizer is the last thing I'm discussing because, in my opinion, as a beginner orchid grower, it's the last thing you really need to worry about. There are tons of orchid growers who really pride themselves on never once having ever fertilized their orchids, and I think that's kind of interesting. So we have to remember that in the wild, orchids do not receive a lot of nutrients. So think about when they're growing on a tree. It's not like someone's walking around and spraying them down with fertilizer. What happens is it rains, and as the rain comes down the trees, it collects dead flies, dead bugs, other little micronutrients that have existed on the tree, and it washes them down across the root system of the plant and then off. So that's really how an orchid has evolved to consume nutrients. So it is a very, very, very light feeder. And that's speaking specifically to epiphytic orchids, or the ones that grow in the trees. But even terrestrial orchids can be light feeders, sometimes even more so than epiphytes. So if you're going to fertilize, make sure that you're using a very, very dilute solution. Ensure that you are using something that is specific for orchids, because if you use full concentration Miracle Grow, you're gonna immediately burn the root tips and kill your plant. So I would say don't worry so much about fertilizer as you're starting. Just make sure you stabilize all of the other components that we've discussed so far, and you should be just fine. Now, if you are able to take all of the feedback I've just provided you and mobilize it, I have every confidence that your orchid will survive. But in order to take your orchid from the place of where it's surviving to where it's thriving, you have to do that research, you have to get more site specific, and you have to develop a personal relationship with it, because like people, they're going to need different things at different times. So you have to do the work now. It's all on you, but I have full faith in you. Now, if you want to start thinking about the next steps, you can always check out my specific system. So if you expand the video description, you'll see that I have a section called My Setup Explained. I talk about how I water, what potting medium I use, how I fertilize, all of that good stuff, and you can start to get more and more refined with how you approach your collection. And with that, we're pretty much done. Thank you guys so much, as always, for choosing to spend your time with me. If you have any questions, concerns, or feedback, go ahead and leave it in the comment section below. Don't forget to click subscribe, and have a beautiful rest of your day. Mwah! Bye, guys.